Today I'm going to look at 4 lessons on vision from Henry Ford. You may know that Henry Ford revolutionized mass production of the automobile. Because of that, it can be tempting to look at his success and forget about where he came from, and the failures that he endured, and how he had to go against the status quo. And if we go back to his world before the success came, what would we find in him? What allowed him to endure his failures and see beyond what the automobile was at that time? Was it simply his mechanical intelligence? Was it his business savvy? While those were things that he eventually showed expertise in, I believe his biggest differentiator from the start was his vision. You see, when Henry first saw horseless carriages in magazines in the 1890s, he was awestruck. By that time, he had already apprenticed himself in machinery for over a decade in Detroit. But he grew up on a farm at a time when transportation outside the railroad was terrible. He felt isolated. Seeing these early automobiles intrigued him more than any other machine he had ever seen or worked on. But they were expensive, and the world viewed them as merely luxury items for the wealthy. But Ford saw it differently. He remembered the isolation that he felt growing up on the farm and the mobility that he craved. He believed that other people shared those same feelings. He thought if he could build an inexpensive and reliable car, that he could change people's lives. And that's exactly what he set out to do. Which brings me to the first lesson on vision, that great change begins with a great vision. To bring about a great change means to go against a status quo. And while everyone else was operating under the idea that automobiles were luxury items, Ford used his imagination to formulate a different path. And that different path is one that would revolutionize American life. But before that could happen, Ford would have to do something about his vision. And that leads me to the second lesson on vision, that realizing your vision requires a leap of faith. Ford had developed his mechanical intelligence since his youth, taking apart watches and reassembling them, and then later working long hours as a machinist in Detroit. He eventually became the lead engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, but his vision would also require him to become an entrepreneur, something he was not yet well versed in. Ford had 2 choices. 1, he could ignore his vision, or 2, he could take action on it. As one of Ford's contemporaries, Thomas Edison, once said, "Vision without execution is hallucination." So Ford got busy. In a workshop behind his house, he began to build engines and other parts. After many late nights, on June 4th, 1896, Ford drove his own horseless carriage out onto the streets of Detroit. It was one of the country's first cars, and he called it the quadricycle. It would take 3 more years for him to get enough investors to start his first company, called the Detroit Automotive Company, in 1899. The company's first production car was heavy and had engine problems. His investors pushed him for a new expensive model for the wealthy, but Ford disagreed fundamentally, as he wanted to build a car for the everyday man. His leap of faith was put to the test, even within his own company. And speaking of being put to the test, this brings us to the third lesson, that realizing your vision requires perseverance. As Ford worked to resolve the design problems in the car, his investors grew restless and eventually pulled the plug. A mere 3 years into this new auto industry in America, and Ford blew his chance to be a part of it. Or so it would seem. The fact is, Ford viewed the situation as he was merely apprenticing himself in business. He once said, "One who fears the future, who fears failure, limits his activities." Failure is simply the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. Ford analyzed the failure from his first company. He realized that he tried to make the auto serve too many consumer needs. He knew that it should be smaller and lighter weight. So once again, he got busy. He convinced one of the investors from his first company, William H. Murphy, to give him a second chance. Together, they formed the Henry Ford Company. But Murphy brought in an outsider to supervise the process. And Ford resented the interference from people who knew nothing about design or the high standards he was trying to establish. Ford left the company. At this point in the fledgling car industry, everyone wrote Henry Ford off. But again, Ford viewed these as invaluable learning experiences, and he paid attention to every glitch along the way, and he knew that no matter what investors said, he knew that he needed to work out the bugs. He would have to come up with his own form of organization and business model that would give him the final word on decisions. Unlikely to get a third chance in this highly competitive industry, Ford would also have to figure out how to get new financial backers. By this time in 1901, the notion of race cars had developed, and Ford saw an opportunity to make a name for himself. He built his own race car and took on the most famous driver in America in the first race in Michigan. Although he had no experience driving at high speeds, he had no money to pay a professional to do it, and he believed in the superiority of his engine. But most importantly, he had audacity. He was not afraid to fail. In the 10-mile race, his opponent's engine overheated, and Ford won by nearly a mile. After winning several other races, Ford began to attract new investors. His perseverance had paid off. On June 16, 1903, he incorporated his third company, the Ford Motor Company. He now had complete control over the design and manufacturing of his automobile, and his company would thrive. In a few weeks, the company would unveil their first model, the Model A. It was the lightest car ever made, and it was simple and durable. It was assembled along a line that was an early predecessor to his later manufacturing innovations. Not satisfied with the Model A's design, Ford continued to innovate the car, releasing a new version every few months. Others could see that Ford's mind went to the farmer and the mechanic and to the common people. His employees were excited for the vision. In October 1908, after 2 years of innovating and selling different models, Ford released the Model T. This car could go 40 miles per hour. It was reliable, durable, and very economical. In a time when the average car cost $2,000, Ford's Model T cost just $850, and that price would soon drop. This was the model that revolutionized American life. It allowed people from nearly all walks of life to enjoy the freedom of an automobile. With the car's design now solid, Ford turned his attention toward manufacturing efficiency with the goal of producing 1,000 Model Ts per day. It was then that they added the moving assembly line to their production. It dropped the assembly time from over 12 hours down to just 90 minutes. Ford would go on to produce a host of other innovations as he grew the company. By 1921, still selling only the Model T, the Ford Motor Company sold about 2/3 of all cars built in the U.S. Ford had become one of the most successful businessmen in the world. By all accounts, he had achieved his vision. But change was in the air. Which brings me to my fourth lesson on vision, that at some point, we must reevaluate and update the vision. When the 1920s came, people became interested in other styles and designs, and Ford despised that, feeling that people should be shrewd buyers. General Motors president Alfred P. Sloan saw what the future was beyond the Model T. He initiated yearly model changes in many varieties with the mantra, "Cars for every person purpose." In 1924, Ford outsold competitors 6-1, but sales began to drop sharply, and Chevy sales tripled. By 1926, Ford's market share fell to 1/3 of the market, and Ford still refused to entertain the idea of a new car, stating that the Model T is the most perfect car in the world. He felt that the only thing wrong with it was that it was not being produced fast enough. Within Ford's company, nearly everyone knew that the company was in jeopardy. After a year and a half of internal strife over the issue, Ford begrudgingly agreed to design a new model. By the time Ford released the new model, their market share had plummeted to 15%. Ford would never regain the dominance that he once had. The very vision that once propelled Ford to success now worked against him because he would not update it. In conclusion, if we go back and look at Henry Ford before the success came, what we find in him is a great vision. And 4 lessons we can learn from him are: number 1, that a great change begins with a great vision. Number 2, realizing your vision requires a leap of faith, action to go along with your vision. Number 3, realizing your vision requires perseverance, that failure is simply the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. And number 4, reevaluate and update your vision. As we think about the story of Henry Ford and about our own vision, maybe we can realize that we're not so different than Henry Ford was. We have our own opportunities to advance and to fail with a vision. I'm Jason Kyle Frank with Thriving Creator, and I'll see you next time.